Okay, I guess I'll start now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture by John Burroughs, our distinguished visitor in the Department of English and Film Studies for this year, this pandemic year. This is the late night session. This is intended as the traditional town and gown lecture, so it's held a little bit later in the day to encourage members of the community outside the university to attend, who might have work or family or other commitments during the day. I'll begin with my territory acknowledgement, actually the university's. The University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Once again, I'll introduce John Burroughs, the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria. And once again, I'll encourage everyone to see the introductory lecture from Monday, which you can access through the Department of English and Film Studies webpage. Simply go to the webpage, click on John's picture, which is right there when you open the page, and go to his events and click on the YouTube link. Currently, we're having a little trouble with some of the links. The first two events are fine. The subsequent events seem to lead you back to the first two events. So we're, I hope, going to correct that problem tomorrow, but I've been assured by Claire Peters that if you simply do a YouTube search to the effect of John Burroughs, Distinguished Speaker, University of Alberta, you will actually get all of the links from YouTube and find your own way there to all of the events recorded so far. Let me just repeat our summary of John's lecture today to get everyone focused for tonight's event. The title of John's lecture will be Laws, Indigenous Ethics. This lecture will examine the revitalization of Indigenous peoples' relationship to their own laws, and in so doing, attempt to enrich Canadian constitutional law more generally. Organized around the 7 Anishinaabe grandmother and grandfather teachings of love, truth, bravery, humility, wisdom, honesty, and respect, the lecture explores ethics in relation to stories, title, treaties, legal education, slip of the tongue there, and residential schools. Sorry for the verbal typo, John, but that is the introduction. Let me hand you over to John Burroughs, who has been a gripping speaker for us all week.
Miigwech, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for coming out this evening. I know you've had a long day, and so my gratitude and appreciation is deep and wide. I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak to you again from Wasanich territory and Lekwungen territory, and recognize the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation and the Douglas treaties here and the relationships that I've enjoyed as people have taught me about law in this place. As was mentioned, I'm going to talk about laws, Indigenous ethics, and I want to preface this by introducing myself in Anishinaabe Moon again. Buju Nidinwe Magani Dog, Niji Anishinaabe, Niji Madazig, Bangi Etzigo Ninata Anishinaabeem, and Guguri Chunjishnawayan, Giganos, Indigenikas, Neashi Winigaming and Donjaba, Nigigan Dodem. Grateful to be able to say I'm from the Cape Croker Indian Reserve, Neashi Winigaming, and I'm from the Otter Totem, Nigigan Dodem, and my name is Giganos, which is my third great-grandfather's name and the name that I also carry. I want you to think about this beautiful territory that I'm going to put before you here. This is a part of the Niagara Escarpment where our reserve is located. And you can see the limestone bluffs of that escarpment, 440 million years old. Ontario used to be where the equator is, and the plates have drifted north. But when these escarpments were formed, Ontario was a shallow, warm sea, And there was all this life that would teem within the waters. And so when you walk around the reserve, you find these beautiful fossils along the shore, and they point to a time before humans were even present. And from that life and from that time, of course, has been generated all of the soils and then insects and fish and birds and plants and animals that give rise to the Anishinaabe and the places where we find ourselves today. There's a lot of wildlife on the reserve, and it's a beautiful part of the world. And I want to tell you an experience that I had that tries to encapsulate these ethics in an integrated way. So every year when it's not COVID, for the last 6 or 7 years, I've taken students home to the reserve from different law schools. So 1 week it might be University of Toronto law students come in for 4 days, and then another week Osgoode Hall law students, and then another week McGill law students, and also had the opportunity to go to Walpole Island with Windsor students, and also Chippewa of the Thames with University of Western students. And it's always a pleasure to be in that space because it's learning in a way that is decentering the legislatures and parliaments and courts and judges and lawyers and police, to see that law is an activity. It's something that we do, and it flows from our relationship with the natural world around us. And it is spontaneous. You never know what lessons are going to present themselves that illustrate this idea that law comes from the earth, it comes from the people, and it's practiced in a community setting. So one of these mornings in September, I was home, and I'm a runner, and I've been running maybe for about 40 years now. I get out every morning for about 35, 45 minutes and just try to enjoy the morning. And so as I was running, I was cutting across what we call the 401, which is a little road on the reserve, to the Prairie Road. And as I'm running along the Prairie Road, I see these beautiful escarpments off to one side, and the mist is just starting to rise because it's dawn. And so it's clearing the fields, and there's this sense of a bit of mystery as these tendrils of precipitation gather around me. But as I'm running along the Prairie Road, I look far ahead, and I see a glint of metal up in a driveway where the Johnsons have their cottages. And that's unusual. I don't usually see things like that at that time of day. And so I wondered what it was. And as I get closer, I can see this glint of metal is out behind a juniper tree on that prairie at the end of the driveway. And then when I get closer, I see that it's one of our police officers that's standing there with a gun. And then I see everything else that's before me, and I suddenly recognize this is a really important moment, which started much earlier in the day. About 4 o'clock, my cousin Nick Saunders woke up to get ready to fish for the day. As the Saugeen and Anishinaabe people, as the Chippewa of the Nawash, we have a treaty right that we received from the Creator, but we also received recognition of that right from Queen Victoria in 1847, and then we entered into treaties that also referenced these rights in the 1850s. And so he was waking up to get ready to go fishing for the day. And so he would have driven down that driveway to the shore. And in the morning, as the sun was not up, he was starting to prepare for the day. And that requires filling the boat's engines with gas and making sure that you've got your equipment with you, including making sure that all the nets are as they should be. And as he's doing this in the darkness, mostly, he hears this splashing out in the water, and he wonders what it is. It's obvious. It's intruding into the peace of the morning, But as he looks out, he can't quite see anything. And he thinks it's probably a dog, or it could be something that's caught in the water. And so he goes back to work, and it takes about, an hour to get ready for the day. And finally, the time comes as the morning light is just starting to come over the water. He pushes out with his boat into the Georgian Bay. And as he does so, he pulls up aside where this commotion is happening in the water, and he sees something there that's big and it's black and it's dark. He thinks it might be a dog, but he's not quite sure. And so what he does is he reaches over the side of the gunnels of the boat, and then he struggles and pulls in this animal. And it's there now in the boat with him, and it's a bear. And it's a bear that's got its head stuck in one of those big plastic caskets. And so, obviously something was in there. The bear was trying to get it, and he got this lodged, and he couldn't get out. And in his confusion, ran into the water, and it must have been only the floating of the bucket itself that saved him, even as it was the thing that was causing him distress. And so Nick takes the bear, and he goes back to the shore with the boat, and then he tries to haul the bear out of the boat, which he is successful in doing. But what does the bear do in its fright, its anxiety, its concern? But it darts right back into the water, and it ends up, it's a pretty steep drop off. It ends up being out close to where it was before. So Nick has to start all over again. He pushes the boat out into the water, comes up beside this animal. It's about 140 pounds. He wrestles it back into the boat over the gunnels, and comes back once again into the shore. But this time he's learned his lesson. And so he searches around in the equipment that he has with him for something that might hold the bear in place. And he takes one of those yellow nylon ropes, and he ties it around the chest of the bear, underneath its front legs. And so this time, when the bear is out of the boat, Nick is able to hold on to it with this nylon rope. But this bear is still stressed, it's still anxious, it's still afraid, it's still confused, it still has a bucket on its head. So what does it do? It just starts running down the shore. And so there is Nick at the sunrise, chasing this bear out for a walk in the morning as he's stumbling back and forth on these very loose rocks. And that's a challenge for a while. And Nick says, what am I going to do? What have I got myself into? But then things take a turn as the bear literally turns and lunges into the bush. And Nick is still got a hold of the rope, and now the bear is just crashing through the woods, and Nick is getting these branches brushing up against his eyes, and just slashing at his limbs, and he's losing his footing because of the dense undergrowth. He doesn't know if he can hold on, but he doesn't want to let go either, because if he lets the bear go with the rope, the bear is liable to get caught, and he doesn't want to be responsible for the bear's distress if it's somewhere and just perishes because it's caught by the rope. So he hangs on. Eventually, the bear emerges from the forest onto the prairie and runs across the prairie until he's at that driveway that I mentioned earlier. Now, Nick had a friend with him along this, and so this friend had phoned the police on his cell phone, and so the police came, and they were standing there. There were two of them with Nick and his friend and the bear, who was really distressed, just rolling around in the dirt when I got there, just beside itself, trying to allay some of the pressure that it was under. And there was no help, no aid. And so this was a challenge. And so they wondered what they could do. And they phoned the volunteer fire department, Ashley, who was the chief, firefighting chief at that time. And so off Ashley prepares, and Ashley comes down with his truck and looks at the bear and thinks, I can't quite do anything here. And so what next happens is they call the Ministry of Natural Resources to come and help out. But the challenge is the people from the ministry are down in Markdale, which is like an hour and a half away. And so, you know, they have to try to figure out what they're going to do in that setting. And so that's when I'm there. They've called the ministry. Ashley has just arrived, and this bear is in distress on the end of a rope right in front of us. As this is going on, my daughter, who's also a co-teacher with me in the law camps, she went running, and she shows up about 20, 30 minutes into the situation. So there's this group of us standing there. As the bear is struggling, every once in a while it rests, because it's just, you know, who knows how long it was in the water, who knows how long it was actually running along the shore, through the forest, across the prairie. It's just exhausted. And when it's exhausted, they recognize that there's a moment there that they can take to perhaps come and help out. And so what occurs is Ashley gets some wire cutters that he has in his truck. And with those wire cutters, he starts to work away at the neck of the bucket to try to take the bucket off the bear's head. And, you know, this, you know, can work a little while, and the bear gets all riled up again, and you have to leave it alone. And then it exhausts itself again. You work a little more. Eventually, the cutters they do their job. There's success. They're able to pull the bucket off of the head of the bear. And so that's great news, right? Until you recognize that you're standing in the driveway with a bear that now has these teeth that are suddenly unleashed. Fortunately, the bear wants to stay as far away from Nick as he possibly can. And so he strains against the rope and tries to get to the farthest end of the rope as possible. But every once in a while, he comes a little closer. And in fact, one time he comes close enough that he bites Nick in the leg, and the teeth go through his, his fishing boots, which are thick, but nevertheless not thick enough to prevent a bear's teeth from going in through them and into his leg. Obviously that hurts, but again, Nick still doesn't want to let go, recognizing that he can't let this bear loose with this rope tied around him and potentially getting stuck in the area. So he's paying a price for what he's trying to do to help this little one. Eventually what happens is this bear finds that juniper tree and climbs up the juniper tree. And so there's a bit of relief from the drama until one of the constables points with his lips and has us look over at the tree line. And what's at the tree line but the mother bear standing on her hind legs? And so you can imagine the further adrenaline that gets built up because of that, because if that mother bear comes towards the group of us here to try to do something about its baby, the life of that mother's in danger because of those constables there with those rifles. And so what do you do in that situation was part of what we were worried about in that moment. And so there we're in this kind of standoff, the little baby bear in the tree, the mother at the tree line, and us just trying to figure out what's going to happen. Fortunately, eventually, the people from the Ministry of Natural Resources show up, and they assess the situation, and they recognize this is very unusual, but they get to work right away. They size up the bear, how much it might weigh, and they're the ones that told us it was probably about 140 pounds, and they start mixing their concoction together, which is a tranquilizer, right? They want to try to get this bear in a state that's calm so they can free it from the rope and it can be on its way. And so they do their work, and as they eventually are finished with that, they pull out one of those huge syringes and they put it on the end of a huge long metal rod so that they can eventually from quite some distance poke the bear with the syringe so that it will fall asleep, which they're able to do. When the bear, we've got it down from the tree, just as that happens, and the bear struggles some more, but eventually just goes limp. And at that point, there's a sigh of relief, although the mother's still there against the tree line. And my daughter gets her picture taken with the bear, and we're able to untie the rope from around its chest. And when the bear comes to, we're all standing back, off it runs towards the tree line, and we've had a happy resolution as a result. So I go on my way, and my daughter goes on her way, and we finish our run, and then we get ready to visit with the law students in the Anishinaabe Law Camp that's happening that morning and all that day. As I reflected on this, I reflected the idea that there's Anishinaabe law that's in action here. And let me try to explain to you some of the ways that Anishinaabe law is present. First of all, Nick is exercising his treaty right. Now, when you exercise a treaty right, it's not just a single-minded focus to go out and get the fish. Right? The fish are related to the rest of the ecosystem, and those responsibilities are never abandoned as you're thinking about exercising that right. It's about all of creation, Nindinwe Maganidug, all of our relations. And so Nick, as an exercising his treaty right, recognizes he has responsibilities and obligations to the natural world around him. And so that's how he's exercising his treaty right in that very holistic way. So that's a part of Anishinaabe law. Another part of Anishinaabe law is that Nick Sanders is the chief, is the head counselor. He's not the chief of the community, but he's the head counselor elected under the Indian Act. And so he has responsibilities as Ogima, a leader, to be able to create a situation where those that are vulnerable are protected in our place. And that vulnerability, of course, extends to the bear as well as the people that are around us on the reserve. Ogima in Anishinaabe, Basil Johnson told me, is a variation of Agandaso, which means to count. And Basil talked about Ogima as someone who can count their followers or to be counted on to take responsibility in a certain place. Right? So there's the treaty law that's present here. There's the Indian Act that's present here. But now I've just introduced the traditional way of thinking about leadership in our community that he's also exercising, trying to be someone who can be counted and also be counted on to show this sacrifice. And obviously his sacrifice was fairly significant given that he wasn't out fishing. He'd gone through some grief on the shore and through the forest, also got bitten as a result of what's going on. But there's another piece of Anishinaabe law here as well, because Nick is of the Bear clan, right? Makwa Ododaman. He's from the Makwa Dodan, the Bear clan. And so this is his relative, right? It's actually his older, even though it's a baby bear, it's his older brother. And so he has a responsibility to ensure that his clan, his older brother, is taken care of and is not harmed or hurt in that situation. Right? So there's all of those layers of Anishinaabe law going on at that moment, which are very profound, but it gets added to, because who did we call? But we called Ashley, who is the volunteer firefighter. He's a non-native man, but he's married into the community. And so people who are from away are an important part of our legal system. And we called upon him, and he had some tools and some resources to help relieve some of the stress from that bear as the wire cutters took off the bucket that was over his head. And so that's an important part of Anishinaabe law to recognize. It's not just about ethnicity. It's not just about race. It's not just about our own self-determination. It's about co-determination. It's about working with other people that are part of our families, that are married into our relations. And so that was an important part of the work. And then of course, there's an obvious, probably most obvious connection of law here, is that you've got these two police officers. And sometimes people say, well, we can't have the police being a part of Anishinaabe law. That's a occupying force. It's an outside force. It's not part of who we are. But one of these people is a member of our community. He had 25 years of service on the force, and the other person knew the community very well and grew up in Owen Sound, or served in Owen Sound before coming. In other words, the police were there, and they were invited there, and they were there to ensure that no harm came to the folks, not to take aggressive action, but to be there to protect. And that protection would maybe had been needed to be exercised had that mother bear come along, although who knows how that would have gone. So that's another element of Anishinaabe law. We have ways of incorporating contemporary parts of our world. It's not like an either or, a traditional way or a contemporary way. They're just, it's what you do in the present moment to take the resources that are at hand as you're co-creating this law. Right? You can see this action is co-creating an approach that creates some peace and some order and some coordination between people and between the people in the natural world. But of course, that's not the only part as well. You've then got these people from government, the province of Ontario, who are sometimes in opposition to us, but they can also come there in aid. And when we reached out, they came with technology and resources that we didn't have to ensure that that bear could be safe and go free when it received that tranquilizing that occurred at the end. If you think about all of those layers there, you see law's Indigenous ethics. You see law as a verb. It's something you do. It's not something that's just done to you. You see how participatory it is, right? It doesn't need to wait for a band council resolution or act of parliament or the provincial legislature. It doesn't require a judge to come along or a lawyer to interpret what is necessary there, right? Because these different roles of clan and Ogima and the fishing and the people that are married in and the government and the police, and these are all just a part of what makes our law there a living tradition. But it extends beyond that as well, because here we are as two otters, my daughter and myself, who are teachers, right? And so then we have an opportunity to observe what's happened and record the judgment, right? And now we don't write it down in a case book, but we can write it down, and it is written down in the book, Laws Indigenous Ethics, but it continues to live in this way that I'm talking to you about today. And then we can think about that as precedent for other situations that we might find ourselves in. That is, what went on there might provide guidance for other things that we could do in our lives and in our communities. So when I think about that point, I want to introduce this idea, which is to understand law from a functional perspective. That is, law as standards, principles, processes, criteria, measures, indicia, benchmarks, precedents, guides, intellectual and cultural resources for regulating our affairs, that is, making decisions and resolving our disputes. There's something very important in this story that puts law in that functional light. And if it's in that light, then what does this story help us reflect upon in contemporary terms? In other words, who has their head in a bucket? What kind of anxiety and distress and threat are we under because we have someone, some group, some people with their head in this place where they're just floundering around? And how did it come to be that we find ourselves in this situation where someone, some people, some group are in this place where they're distressed and not able to see and not able to take the way that they should be? And who are the ones that might function like Nick and the police and the fire chief and the Ministry of Natural Resources and the teachers that come along and observing by the way, right? That is, if we think about analogizing what's going on here or distinguishing what's going on here, do we see an allegory? Do we see a metaphor? Do we see a possibility of ourselves in the story? And if we see ourselves in that story, what is the actions then that we can take to co-create a law, to bring some distress to an end, to bring a sense of healing, but do so in the face of protection, where there's also maybe some sacrifice, where some people are really filling their sense of obligation and duty after that fact. You know, we could think about those things. And if we were in a law class now, we would just stop. I would invite you to contribute and work on this sense of what does this case mean for other situations that we find ourselves in. It's a really fascinating exercise when that occurs, because then there's a further co-creation, right? As people add their interpretation, there's new insights that can be revealed. There's new potential gaps that are also identified. And so that's a very powerful thing. And what I hope you can see here is that in this story, all of our grandmother and grandfather principles are illustrated. Zigidwin, Debwewin, Nabuakawin, Manajidwin, Zungadewin, Guakwadiziwin, and Daba Dane Dizuwin. That is, I think present in this story is love, truth, wisdom, respect, bravery, honesty, and humility. These are the 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe, and they're just there in that story. And we could talk about that. What's also interesting about these words is they're correlated to the natural world. Zagidawin refers to the river mouths. Debwewin refers to the way sound travels through the air. Truth. So Zagidawin, love, refers to the river mouths. Debwewin refers to the way sound travels through the air. Nabuakawin is actually the admission of light. It refers to the sun and our ability to receive light. Manajidawin is the idea of respect. It's to go easy on one another. Zungadewin, the word heart, is there. So it actually means a strong heart. And so that's referring to something physical in the world. And Guakwadiziwin, that is the idea of being unobstructed, without sort of variation. That's honesty. And then Daba Dane Dizuwin is humility. You might have heard of a place in Toronto called Spadina. It's Ishpadana. It means going up the hill. Ishpadana. Daba Shish is to go down. Pasadena is actually a valley. So you heard of Pasadena in California. That means to be in a lower space. The reason Pasadena is named Pasadena is because the land development companies there took the word from around the Illinois area where Anishinaabe, Algonquian speaking peoples were, and they just transported that to the coast. But the point is that humility refers to not assuming a heightened spot in the way that you're proceeding. And you could see that in Nick's action, but you can also see that in the physical landscape that surrounds us. Now, what Anishinaabe people are doing is they're taking those 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings, and they're referencing these unwritten traditions that connect to the earth, and they're also practicing in them in their stories, and then they're putting them into written constitutions. And so here in this constitution, which is from the Anjouanong First Nation, you have reference to these principles in the middle of their preamble. And these principles are often in the clauses themselves, not just in the preamble of the constitutions. And that's significant. There's over 43 Anishinaabe First Nations in the province of Ontario that have picked up this way of expressing their constitutionalism in writing. And you also find this in tribal court judgments from Anishinaabe people in Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. But let's just pause here and think about laws of Indigenous ethics with what's written. Ningudwe Wangizit Anishinaabe, one Anishinaabe family. Debanjagade Gi San Anishinaabe and a king, Gibit Dukwan Gadane Manadu Wadazuin. Creator placed the Anishinaabe on the earth along with the gift of spirituality. Shkode, Nibe, Akit, Noden, Gibit Gosanon, we Naganame Namang, Mam Pishikamikon. Here in Mother Earth, there were gifts given to the Anishinaabe to look after. They are fire, water, earth, and wind. Debanjagade Gimi non Getchwa Wayne Dog Anishinaabe, Wa Naganwaindan Nindwa Nishwasi Kinamadwanan. The Creator also gave the Anishinaabe 7 sacred gifts to guide them. They are, as I've expressed, Debwewin, love, Zagidwin, love, Debwewin, truth, Manan Didwin, Manan Dane Dumawin, respect, Nabakawin, wisdom, Daba Dane Dizwin, humility, Wak Wadisiwin, honesty, and Akadewin or Zungadewin, bravery. Debanjagade ki minigona debenaway we nagdawindawin. Creator gave us sovereignty to govern ourselves. Ka mandadendana gabi jawebag minwa nango megwa ejawebag minwa gayabi wa njawebag. We respect and honor the past and the present and the future. And as Anishinaabe people exercise their constitution in this way, they're bringing to life the animacy of the world around us. So many things in Anishinaabe are living. If you were to learn about our nouns in our language, there's animacy and inanimacy. So like in the French, you would learn what's gendered, male and female. In Anishinaabe, when you would learn what's animate and inanimate. And some of the things that are animate are not necessarily the case in English. It's also the case that our language is very verb-based. I mentioned this in an earlier lecture. Here's our word for blueberry pie. Which is old-time Frenchmen taking berries, putting them between layers of bread, bending over, putting that bread in the oven, and watching the berries explode. If you think about law and ethics as verb-based, as related to animacy, as related to the natural features of the earth around us, you will see that it's directed towards this sense of functionality, trying to provide guidance that's co-created between people that's just drawn from the earth that surrounds us. These principles are great principles of connectivity and hope. And I'm thankful for the possibilities that are a part of these things. So I think I'll stop there. And if there's questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And this book, as Christopher talks about, takes us through those 7 grandmother and grandfather principles and talks about treaties in relationship to love and truth. And then it talks about Aboriginal title in relationship to honesty and wisdom. And then it talks about legal education. And then it talks about respect in relationship to residential schools. And there are many different stories that are intermingled here with what a law professor does, which is also parse cases that are from the Supreme Court of Canada or legislation, and tries to mix and mingle these things together to perhaps not just talk about Anishinaabe people's ethics, but also gesture towards the idea that Anishinaabe people might have something to say to Canadian law that Canadian law could also pick up and learn about, and perhaps find places for love more explicitly, or honesty or respect more explicitly in the work that we do. So I'm looking forward to any questions or comments that you might have related to the story or the themes that I've tried to develop with you this evening.
Excellent. Thank you, John. What a great story. First question, did you see the bear again?
I did not see the bear again, but the bear had been playing outside and behind the bed and breakfast on the reserve. And it was getting into the chickens. And so you can imagine the challenge that's there. But let me say this about the bears. When I go running on the reserve, like I said, it's in the morning, I'll often be surprised by bears. They'll run out of the forest and they'll see me, and I'll start like this, but the bear will also start, and the bear will turn around and it'll run away just as quickly in the other direction. These bears do not want confrontation. They want to live on their own terms. And so that's the kind of relationship we often have. But every once in a while, a bear gets itself more involved with us. And so there has to be other action that's taken that could be fatal to the bear, could be relocated in some instances. Sometimes the bear has to be put down if it's a threat to the children that are around.
Right. I live near the university farm where there's a vibrant community of coyotes who have been very active as humans have been less active over the past year. I'm always astonished at the kind of oddly respectful behavior of the coyotes who want, because when the farm is in bloom, you'll often almost stumble over a coyote that you can't see over the wheat field, right?
Yes.
It's a procedure. It will run about 25 meters away and stop and turn around and look at you. Or it will go down the same street as you do, but will like cross the street. So it's like, it's very much thinking about relationships and respectful relationships all the time.
Exactly.
We've
just come through in Anishinaabe territory. February is sometimes called Makakonsigizis, which is the Bear Cub Moon. Why is it called that? Because as the bears are hibernating under the earth, they give birth to their young. And those little ones, they find their way to the mother's breast and they start being nourished in that dark space underground. And that's a hopeful thing for the Anishinaabe, thinking that while life is so hard on the surface, underneath the surface, there's this gestation, there's this regeneration, there's this hope for a new year. And one of the signs of that moon, Makakonsigizis, is that mists start to rise across the land as you get some thawing, and with the thawing, you get the precipitation spreading out through the area. And some Anishinaabe say that is the representative of the mother's afterbirth from that bear giving birth. And so when you see that phenomenon in February of that mist in going through the sky, people realize, oh, it's Makakonsigizis. These bears are being nourished under the earth. And the other part of that, which is interesting to me, is the etymology of this. Makak is the Anishinaabe word for box. And so Makakons is a small box. And so those bears are in that small box. And those little bear cubs are the little ones that are boxed up. And I also mentioned the other day about frogs, Umakaki. Makak again is the word for box. Aki is the word for earth. So there's all these animals boxed in the earth that just wait to spring forth, which is, as you observe the coyotes and the bear and the deer, there's just an opportunity to have deep appreciation, think about these ethics, and look to the natural world around us and draw strength from that.
Thanks. Any questions from the floor? You can, again, put up your virtual hand, your real hand, or resort to the chat function. Kiwi has her hand up. Go ahead, Kiwi.
Hi there, John. Thank you so much for this series. It's been so wonderful, and Chris for organizing. Listening to that story, I was just noticing the kind of intergenerational elements, as you can hear my son crashing around in the background here, and how you've got this mother bear and yourself and your daughter. And it's just getting me to think of something that's been coming up lately, which is the reality of these different generations and their different approaches to these situations, some being, thank you, a little more reckless
her, her, her eye, her eye, her eye.
It's good to be able to get that voice coming through, right? It shows enthusiasm.
Like precisely what I'm talking about, just different approaches. So
Yes.
I'm just wondering if, you know, if that has a kind of a legal implication for you at all.
Absolutely so. So when we do the Anishinaabe camps, what you just presented to us is exactly what happens all the time. We have kids and babies and elders and mothers and fathers that will come in and out of the circle as the case might be. And that presents a wonderful occasion for recognizing that we can learn from the little ones, the spontaneity, the joy, the disruption. Like, who doesn't want disruption and ways to just be relieved from the monotony of professors droning on and just always being up here this way. It's just so nice. It's so healthy to be embodied and to be switching registers and being more open to all the things that surround us. And so, yes, that's definitely a big part of Anishinaabe law. And it's a part of what happens with our law camps as well. And I always love it in the law schools whenever we get that intergenerational engagement as well, because it just moves us in other directions. And so, yeah, thank you for that. It's a really important piece of what we need to do, is recognize it's not just the elders that have knowledge or that can prompt us. There's lots of gifts in the young ones too. Thanks.
Anyone else? Another question? I'm going to go to gallery view.
I see Catherine might have a question there.
Hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Burrows, for speaking today. And thank you, Christopher Bracken and all of the IT for putting this together, making it possible. I actually got to attend one of your law camps a couple of years ago in Niashiniming. And so I got to do that practice of interpreting stories. And one of the things that kind of struck me at the time of being a student and coming from a literary background of wanting to interpret things correctly was that during that time I was really trying. Can you speak perhaps about the fear of misinterpreting?
Yeah, that's a great point. So one of the issues in Anishinaabe law is to encourage the agency of the listener and their own ability to enter into a relationship with the story at different levels, at different times of life. And so, a child can hear this story that I told, and they might have one way of thinking about it. And then the person involved in it might have another way. A student hearing it at a camp might have another way of being involved. And that is welcome. That's actually one of the purposes of doing that, is to empower that's the word, the agency of those that are part of this legal system. So rather than forcing an interpretation on someone or requiring this story to be interpreted just in one way, there's this recognition that we're able to learn from each other there. Now, there are times in tribal courts where these stories will be taken and they will be used for particular purposes. There's a story about Nana Bojo stealing ducks out of the water and getting himself burned, that has been used in a US tribal court context for a tribal court judge who tried to defraud the community. He was charged and actually eventually found guilty of attempted fraud. So that the story is used in that particular instance to relate to the question of fraud. But after it's finished with the judgment, that story is free to walk into another room or free to walk into another setting and to have a whole other personality as a part of it. It's not just sort of screwed down and the hatch is battened with that just one meaning. And that's confusing to people in a legal setting where cases usually get narrowed through time further and further and further for that story to stand for a few propositions. And that's just not the Anishinaabe legal method in relationship to stories. Now, in terms of telling stories, there's different points of view on that. When I'm at home, the people around us say, if you've heard it 5 times, then you have the permission to be able to tell the story yourself. Because they want people to live in relationship to them. They don't want to, it's just, you know, because they want them to make them their own and find ways that they can be applied in their lives. So that's one way of proceeding with these Dabajamoanan, which are these human stories. The Atazokanag, the older time stories, there's different points of view about that. Some say they can only be told at certain seasons. I can remember having that issue myself. You know, Basil Johnson taught us to tell stories in all seasons, and he gave us all sorts of reasons for doing that. But I can remember teaching at Western Ontario, and as we were teaching, the frog started to peep, and one of our hosts there said, you know, and took us aside after we told the story and said, you're not supposed to tell the story once the frogs start to come out of the ground and make their noise. And so we wanted to learn from that perspective. And so she gently led us through what their opinion was on that. And of course, we're in their territory. They're hosting us. And so of course, we're going to follow the way they interpret the law in that place. But what then it became was a teaching opportunity for the rest of the students that were there, saying, you know, over in my territory, just 3 hours away at Cape Croker, we have one view of this. Here, there's another view of this. Here are the reasons for why we do things our way. Here are the reasons for why we're doing things this way in this particular community. In other words, the story can be differently treated from community to community, depending on the host and depending on who the teacher is in that place. Now, how do you coordinate that difference? You know, it's not by putting it into a hierarchy and just having a final authoritative determination from the head interpreter. It's by always being in dialogue with the people around you and being receptive to, is this okay here? Is this okay there? Which again is an invitation for participation as opposed to domination, is you have to work things out in a co-determined way and a self-determined way, as opposed to an imposed way. That's a challenge, right? And it makes you be nervous, and you can step into all sorts of potholes, but you're learning along the way. And as long as you can take the teasing and the sort of, you didn't quite do this in a good way, you're fine. And it actually adds to the situation. Because, you know, you're not an expert. I'm not an expert in every place that I go, and certainly not. And I'm grateful for that way of thinking about stories. Thanks, Catherine. And good to see you again as well. Christine.
Thank you so much for that. I have so appreciated your talks over the last few days. I have a question about the legal personhood of rivers that has been granted in a few places around the world, including in Quebec, not that long ago with the Magpie River. And I sort of feel sad that that kind of designation is required in order for us to uphold our ethical responsibilities to rivers. And I'm wondering if you might talk about that a little bit. Do you see that as maybe a step in non-Indigenous learning from Indigenous ethics, and maybe almost like, you know, the step that's required right now, almost as a kind of emergency until we reach, you know, collectively a greater understanding of our responsibilities? Or do you see that in and of itself as an example of co-creation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me share a few layers of thought here. A few years ago, we had challenges, as we still do, at Cape Croker around water. We're sometimes under boil water advisories as other communities across the nation. And it's so perplexing that we would be under this boil water advisory, because everywhere you look, there's this beautiful, clean, fresh water in Georgian Bay that's just there right at hand, but we're under a boil water advisory. And it's partially because of the infrastructure of the plant that processes the water in our community that's never sort of fully up to code. And so people are trying to do things about that. And one day the band council got together and said, okay, we're going to create a water law. And this water law is going to have these dimensions of protection and recognition and facilitation of that life force for us. And my daughter and her friend Hannah Askew at the time were working on an Anishinaabe legal report. And they were working with a particular elder in the community. And they were all excited about this development by the band to pass a water law. And so they went to this elder and they told her about it. And she just kind of got this sense of sadness. And she said, laws are for the lawless. And what she meant is it's just such a shame that we've come to this stage where we have to put this down on paper, because the idea is that we should try to carry these laws inside us. And if we can carry these laws inside us, then we don't really need those written laws, because we're doing the work of co-creating and participating in ways that are respectful. So I think that's a powerful lesson. And then if you think about the word for water, it's nit-bit. Nit is the personal pronoun I. Bit means to come towards you. So nit-bit could mean I come towards you. But I have a friend, Danica Littlechild, who's from Treaty 6 area there. She, in Cree, heard that this was a contraction of Nipamadazuin. Nipamadazuin means life. And so the word in Cree for water is I am life. So I'm coming towards you, or I am life. So the fact that life has to be codified and protected by statute can be a real challenge for some people, particularly this elder who wants to see us like those ethics embody the laws, put them inside ourselves and participate together with them. Having said that, there is some positivity that happens by this recognition, because it suddenly directs our attention to the need to secure and ensure that those sources can flow and be helpful on their own and in relationship to those around them. And that is an important step, because agency in the law, personality in the law, does give rise to rights and obligations. And I think about corporations. Corporations are not something that you can kind of point at. They're just paper, artificial beings. Nevertheless, they probably have the most control over our lives by what we do in relationship to them. But how do corporations move through the world? They move through a series of responsibilities that people have to speak in relationship to them, that are fiduciary, that are guiding, that are and nevertheless a big part of the law. So if corporations can have legal personality, I want to say, of course, water should have legal personality, because they're real in a way that corporations aren't real. And I'd love the language to move beyond legal personality to agency again, because rivers are more than persons. They're more than human. And so there are things that we can learn from them if we see them in that light. So that's just a few thoughts in relationship to your question. And there's so much more work to do in that area, but I'm really glad for the opportunity to talk about it.
I'm scanning for other questions.
I think there might be something in the chat here that I can read from Harold. So let me just read this question and then try to answer that. The Indigenous Advisory Committee to the Law Society of Alberta is exploring the idea of having the Law Society apologize to Indigenous peoples for the role lawyers in Alberta have played in developing, implementing, and or interpreting laws meant to destroy or nullify pre-existing Indigenous polities, economies, cultures, meanings, and modes of life, what Professor Parmar calls the foundational violence of colonialism. Question for Professor Dr. Burrows: how might laws Indigenous ethics aid the committee and the Law Society in the development of a potential apology framework? I really love that question because it's a call to use Indigenous law to answer the questions that we face as a society as a whole. As you know, often the law that we use to answer our questions is what Parliament says, or what legislatures say, or what bodies like law societies say, or courts, or police. And here we might be able to be in a situation where Indigenous law itself could provide, as I was saying earlier, that functionality of guideposts, signposts, precedents, standards, criteria, authority, resources for reasoning to regulate our affairs and resolve our disputes. Well, that word respect in the grandmother and grandfather teachings means to go easy on someone. And so if we're thinking about apologies, how might apologies be framed as guac wazuin, being unobstructed, being honest, truth de buewin, a measure of sound, humility, that is not standing above another, but recognizing that sometimes you need to occupy that valley place to take a stand. The idea here is to unpack the word apology. Apology is just a label, right? It has no really guiding force as a legal concept as passed by a statute, but it does have a meaning when we bring it into our human community. And if we do unpack it, then we might think what it means to go easy on one another is to recognize that we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to find gaps. And like I explained in that story a second ago, when I went to teach at the Chippewa of the Thames, I didn't know what their law was there. And I had to go through a process of learning and making better what I didn't know. And that was a great learning experience for me and those around me, I hope. And so that's a part of this. And at the end of the book, I relate a story that Phil Fontaine was involved with, and Toboa Sonaquit and Fred Kelly and another man. There were 4 Anishinaabe men that went through a ceremony with the, I think it was the Archbishop of Manitoba or Winnipeg, where they apologized to him for some of the ways that they characterized him as they were trying to advocate for changing the way that the church was dealing with residential schools. And let me just read from the book here, this point. During the ceremony, Phil Fontaine offered a personal apology to both the Catholic Church and Archbishop Weisberger. Chief Fontaine took responsibility for his public reactions to his personal residential school experience, which overshadowed the goodness of many people. I quote, overshadowed the goodness of many people. He said, quote, "My bitterness and anger hurt many good people dedicated to our well-being, and I only focused on the people who hurt us. I tarred everyone with the same brush, and I was wrong. As you apologized to me on more than one occasion, I apologized to you." And then there's a newspaper report about this, and it said the men shared a ceremonial pipe to the sounds of singing and drumming and exchanged gifts. The Archbishop received a blanket decorated with the 4 colors of the Anishinaabe people, while he presented his 4 new brothers with rosaries. The ceremony, called Na Ba Gunditwin, is traditionally carried out by families to welcome a new relative or to welcome newcomers into their territory, or to bring peace between warring nations, feuding families, or rival villages. Quote, "I have accepted James Weisberger as part of my family, as my brother," Kinnew said. That's Tobosonoquet. "We are now prepared to move ahead as brothers and sisters. I leave the past of the residential schools behind." Now, this is not to say that those who are abused need to apologize to those that have harmed them. That's not what's being said here. But what was recognized by these 4 is that there were things that they did that were overbroad, that were overstated, and that proportionality required them to make good on that, even as things were being dealt with by the church and by others on that other side. Now, this is not so much a focus on the idea of apology, although apology is a part of this. It's about developing relationships and recognizing that our relationships, that we misstep, we fail, we hurt, we harm, And so if the Law Society is going to apologize for what lawyers have done in relationship to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities, it's to not just put that label over things about apology, but it's to enter into a relationship that recognizes the less than that occurred and is occurring right now in these relationships between peoples. I don't see what's wrong with that. I know that sometimes you want to fight to the death in an adversarial system where you don't want to admit any liability, but this is a case where the path of respect is the path of productive understanding of one another, instead of hiding behind tweets and dichotomies and positions that are abstract and not necessarily always related to the people that are standing in front of us or the communities that we feel we're a part of. I don't say that's easy, but I do say it can be done. There's an example there. And I hope that we don't just do that in law societies. I hope we do that when we see the coyotes in the field, like Chris saw, or when you know, we've got a friend and we've not been good with them. There's just so much opportunity to think about this not as an abstract principle, but as a practice. Right? If anything, my book is about practices and trying to verbify or conjugate rather than just classify or characterize what we're doing.
Other questions? I'll warn you, if no one else has a question, I might ask one.
Here's a question in the comment that I might just read here.
Okay.
As you spoke about the Roundhouse today in a grad seminar, I wonder if you might speak about the relationship between literature, ethics, and Indigenous legal orders. I hope that what you've seen in these presentations over the last few days is that the lines between these things are very thin. And that if you're not categorizing and trying to say, what is literature in the abstract? What is law in the abstract? What is ethics in the abstract? If we can find what those definitions are, then we know when we're doing literature, and then we know when we're doing law, and we know when we're doing ethics. You know, there's a place for that. It can bring clarity to understanding what your field is, what your activity is hoping to be. I don't want to completely dismiss that. There is value there in definitional and aspirational abstractions. But in practice, when we're trying to work out things between us, if there's something that comes from literature that provides a normativity that helps us think through why we might make a judgment in a certain way, then that should be a part of law. And if law in a case or a piece of legislation identifies a possibility, I don't see why we couldn't think about that as ethical in some ways. So the fussiness around what is law and what's not law is perhaps not as salient in Anishinaabe legal settings. And I actually think if you push it back the other direction, you see in Western forms of thinking about literature, law, and ethics, that it might not be so bright lined as we think about in the first place. And maybe that's one of the benefits of doing trans-systemic legal education, is it not only reveals what Anishinaabe law might be, but it might also show you more clearly what Western law or literature or ethics might be. That is to say that, I think I've made this point before, that the contrast itself can create self-reflexivity and cause you to rethink what you might have held as sacrosanct, or you might not have even thought about. One of my colleagues, Sarah Morales, was my doctoral student, and she said when she began her PhD thesis, she had all these unanswered questions. And at the end of her PhD, she found that she had many unquestioned answers. Right? In other words, the process of the PhD unpacked and allowed her to see that she had certain answers that she should start questioning. And sometimes what I'm saying here is the questioning of these boundaries can themselves be productive and a part of a transsystemic engagement. Like, you know, fish doesn't know about water until the first time it jumps into the air. We think we know, we're swimming in literature or law or ethics, and then suddenly we jump into another place and we recognize, oh, there's much more there that I was taking for granted, that I was assuming that I wasn't seeing. I didn't know I was in water until I was suddenly in this other environment, and this other environment causes me to see I was in water, or this other environment causes me to see that maybe ethics, law, and literature aren't so distinct as I might have thought before seeing how the Anishinaabe people do it. Lisa, do you have a question?
Oh, hi. Yes. Hi, Annie, John, Dr. My name is Lisa Owl. I'm from Sagmuck and Anishinaabe Quay, you know, Robinson Huron Treaty, just north of you.
Bonjour.
Stories, and especially the one you talked about hugging the tree, because I love hugging trees myself. Yeah, so I really love your story about the bear, because I mean, you know, Mako is so important. Like, I'm Eagle Clan, but you know, as I'm at U of T and I'm relearning the language, because, you know, I never learned it growing up. English was my first language, and it's really hard because I'm finding it's so hard to unlearn English to get Anishinaabe one, right? Like, it's huge, like, it's such a beautiful language, relational, right? Like, I was like, oh my God, when Sean Wilson said, like, not just a couch, it's the place where we sit. So it's totally like, that's beautiful, right? So like, as I speak to other students in my class, they're like, I never thought of it that way. Like, the cross-cultural learning is so like different, like, right? Perspectives are so important, like you said. Like, how, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, with the language, how can we understand, like, others can understand how, to what we know, like our spirituality, right? Like, I mean, we live in such a multicultural world where it's like, oh my goodness, right?
Yes.
Which is so important, the grandfather teachings, like you mentioned.
Yes, I find myself being in the same situation as you are. I'm a second language speaker of Anishinaabe, and it's beautiful and it's wonderful. It's also hard. I'm not fluent by any means. I enjoy leading a language table. I enjoy learning from people who know more, and yet, even when I learn a little bit, I feel like there's a whole world in that little bit. I can just treasure that and keep unpacking it. There's so many lessons that are there. It's just beautiful, right?
Oh, yeah. Sure.
And then I think we have a little bit of an advantage being second language speakers, because we do pause and think about what the meaning of the words are. When I've tried to do that in English and think about the etymology of some of the English words that we use, I actually sometimes get really fascinated, because I recognize there are layers of meaning that are under there that I never even stop to think about, because it just flows off my tongue. I don't have to even give it a second thought. But when I have to give it a second thought in Anishinaabe, the lessons sink a little bit deeper, because understanding etymology, you know, where the word comes from, how it's put together, helps me to be a better language speaker. So I need to be more attentive to that. So not that I have an advantage in the big sense of the word over first language speakers of Anishinaabe, but there's some insights that I can bring because of this position of just being this learner that's you know, always struggling, always laughing. My mother says, if you're not laughing, you're not learning the language.
That's so true. Yeah, so true. My professor is so kind, and he's like, he says, I'm not better than you. We're equals, and we have to have fun. And that's
exactly
with learning, which I find is true, because when I say something, he'll be like, and start laughing away, like, oops. Okay, it's part of learning.
What good medicine to have that laughter. It's such
yeah. For sure.
And your other part of your question is, how do you help others know about this? It might not be Anishinaabe. The land itself provides that opportunity to teach, like Manidoba, the place of the spirits there, or Saskatchewan. G1 is a flow Saskatchewan is a fast flow, Saskatchewan, a fast flowing space, or
Chicago,
Wawa,
or even, yeah.
Place of the Goose, or like I said, Spadina.
Yeah.
Right? So I think some of our friends who don't speak the language from other parts of the world would be interested to know these things, because then they can create a relationship to that place, and they can see a personality that's in that place. When I'm out here with the Wissahick people, I just love learning about the language here, because I see the land in a different way, and I start to relate to it in a different way.
Wow, it's beautiful there. I've heard. I've never been. I'd like to go someday.
It's a gorgeous place.
And
Are
even
you related to Peter Owl? Are you related to Peter at all? Owl?
Sorry?
Are you related to Peter Owl from Sagamore?
Oh, yeah. You know what? It's so funny, because there's other owls, I think, even in Saugeen, I don't even know. Like, Serpent River, it's such a big family.
It is. Yeah, I remember going and meeting Peter at Sagamore about 20 years ago, and we had a great day together.
Oh, okay. Is it a junior too, I think?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I think I might have met the junior. But yeah.
Thanks for that question. That's such a great question.
Language. Thank you.
It's just nice to visit with you like that too. How fun.
Other questions?
Sure, people have had long days, but it's really nice to have had this time together. I want to express my appreciation. It is heartfelt. I know you're doing other things and could be doing other things, but just to have a moment together to talk and visit and feel encouraged from each other, that's a gift. And so thank you for that. I'm going to walk home this evening. Just my house is about 5 houses off campus, and look at the stars and just carry that with me with appreciation.
Maybe I'll ask one last question, which I don't know how to ask because it's been a long day. And I feel like I've got a bucket on my head now. Been on there for about a year now. You spoke about animacy, and I was really kind of bowled over when you spoke about Anishinaabe being less concerned, say, with gender and more with animation. Could you say something more about animacy and what animacy means or means for you or means in the law?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. Animacy means that there is communication that is beyond what we formulate as Anishinaabe or English or other languages. And when Anishinaabe people sing, you often get a sense of that because in our singing, we have Anishinaabe and then we have vocables. And vocables are kind of that other language that is not necessarily easy to sort of put out in a way that connects with our minds like English or Anishinaabe do. So just to give you a small example, I'm not going to sing a whole song, but there's a bear song. The words in the song are Mani Du Makwa, which is a spirit bear. But then the vocables are also trying to communicate about that. And so it goes, Yo, 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 ho, ho, yo, 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 ho, ho, Mani Du Makwa, yo, yo, ho, ho, Mani Du Makwa, yo, yo, ho, ho, yo, yo, ho, ho. And the song goes on like that. And that is recognizing that animacy, that the receptivity to understand that communication occurs beyond, as I said, etymology, beyond morphemes, beyond, and so, and you have to take this on its own terms now. Rivers can speak to you, and you can receive messages from coyotes and bears. And sometimes that can be because of linguistic constructions, and sometimes it can be from the stories, and sometimes it can be from your observation of how they act in the world You get a sense of what their patterns are, their habits are. And when you know a pattern or a habit, you've got a sense of communication, like how you might relate to another because of that. And so all of that's present, and you can take scientific observation into account in that as well to try to understand what you should draw from or learn from that. But going through all that, and there's probably many more, the rationality of those possible ways of explaining that animacy, there's still something more on its own terms that again has to be experienced. It's a phenomenological thing, it's a verb, it's an action, it's something that you do, it's not just an idea. And sometimes you just have to sit with it and not know how you express that, but you know something has gone on there that has presented you with something that wasn't otherwise present. And maybe there's ways of explaining that in psychology, and I appreciate all those ways. I don't want to dismiss them for 1 second. I'm open to them, but I'm also open to this on its own terms. And I find a lot when I'm in my territory that comes from the animacy, the livingness of the world around us.
Great, thank you. Last call for questions. Comments. Okay, so there are no further questions or comments. I think for some reason I'm not getting the chat, so wave your hands if I'm ignoring the chat.
I think we're through with the chat there. I don't see any new questions.
Okay. Well, let's thank John again. We can do this with our emoticons as we have in the past.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming out late at night.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
We have 2 events tomorrow. Remember, there will be John's final lecture in the afternoon, and his office hours at 3. And if you want to join office hours, just send me an email at this address if I can type. No, I just screwed that up. Well, I will continue attempting to type my email, but there we go. If you're ready to go, you can go on your way now. If you want to make an office hours appointment, only one typo this time, that's a rarity. Okay.
Yep, so I'll see you in office hours tomorrow, and then I guess there's that last presentation tomorrow, writing as an Indigenous practice at 3:30 tomorrow.
Yeah, and this time I will sign on to your office hours to make sure it works.
Sounds good.
We're going to try to transfer it technically to you.
Okay, great.
But that has to be done in person, apparently.
Okay.
By the Zoom master.
Well, thank you again for this, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks.
Take care. Bye.